Understanding Alberta's Electricity Challenge, a plain language discussion presented by Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and the Alberta Electric System Operator had a press conference last week to discuss the challenges for Alberta in trying to meet the 2035 net zero targets. I thought that their presentation was a little high level for a lot of people, and a lot of the questions and items that I saw go by on Twitter made me think it might be worthwhile just to do kind of a plain language discussion about our challenges. Now, right off the bat, I want to tell you I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist, but I have worked with engineers and scientists for the past decade. So the information I'm going to convey to you today comes from them. And some of those engineers also work in the electricity generation industry in Alberta. So they have a very clear understanding of what's going on. So the Alberta Electric System Operator, or ISO, had a press conference, and at that conference they pretty much said it's not possible to meet the 2035 clean electricity regulation targets. There's draft legislation out right now, and so that's why they're making these comments. They say there's not enough baseload supply in Alberta, and this would risk blackouts. And the threat of short-term operation for baseload gas plants combined with the potential for criminal charges drives off investors. So when we're talking about the power grid, it's not like your cell phone or anything else. It's a very unique thing. And as the popular Substack Doomberg says, in the war between physics and platitudes, physics is undefeated. So Minister Guilbeault and Premier Smith are facing off. We have an ideologue versus a realist. We have the National Observer saying that Danielle Smith says she is prepared to use the Alberta Sovereignty Act against the Fed's net zero grid plans. The Globe and Mail reported that Ottawa's clean electricity regulations put consumers at risk. And Minister Guilbeault said there will be no exceptions for the net zero grid. That was infuriating to Alberta, and the Pembina Institute here said its own research found multiple ways for Alberta's power system to reach net zero emissions by 2035. Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault also said in an email that any claim that building a clean electricity grid in the next dozen years will lead to blackouts is misinformation designed to inflame and not inform. Surprise! We already had 7 grid level 3 alerts in the fall of 2022. That means a blackout is imminent. And you can see in this compilation graph here, these are stats from the Alberta Electric System Operator. Our load at the time internally was 12,077 megawatts. We were importing 681 megawatts from mostly from BC and Montana and some from Saskatchewan, and we had 0 solar, even though there's a maximum capability of 1,138 megawatts, and we only had 47 megawatts of wind being generated, even though we have 3,618 on the grid. So there was extreme cold all across the province. This is from Environment Canada. And the person who made this called it dying with renewables. So we were importing electricity at a pool price of $999 a megawatt because there's not enough gas and coal capacity. And gas and coal are what's called baseload. So 7 grid level 3 energy emergency alerts in 2022 in Alberta. So I'm not making this up. It comes directly from the Alberta Electric System Operator 2022 Market Statistics Report, which came out in March of this year. There were 7 grid level alerts declared. When it's declared, that means the ISO is unable to meet the minimum contingency reserve requirements and firm load interruption is imminent. Well, what the heck does that mean? It means that they'll have to get rid of some of the demand on the grid. So they'll probably have to go to an industrial provider, maybe someone with whom they already have an existing contract, and say, we need you to shut down. Now, when that happens, that party gets paid compensation fees. It's also quite disruptive to the industry, but that's one possibility. Another possibility is to go to things like rolling blackouts or brownouts. So brownout is where you have less than sufficient power. This can be quite damaging for household appliances. And a blackout is where you simply knock the power out in certain parts of the city or the province for a period of time until that peak demand passes. And the peak demands are usually when it's really, really cold or really, really hot, and there's a lot of demand. And so, as you maybe noticed on that last graphic, that was just before Christmas time. So lots of demand all across the province, especially because it was very cold. So in 2022, the ISO was able to manage the grid alerts so that no firm load was shed. The events occurred in the latter part of the year, 2 in September, 1 in November, and 4 in December. So each event occurred in a time of extreme seasonal demand, but they were precipitated by other factors, such as inter-time maintenance, that's the flow of power between our friendly provinces, low scheduled imports, unplanned thermal unit outages, thermal unit derates, and low renewable generation. So one or more of these reasons led to each of the grid alerts. So why are we in this situation? Well, we have a shortage of dispatchable power. And what is dispatchable power? If you think of your gas stove, when you turn it on, you can turn it on to be very high or very low, and you can do it almost instantly. This is what dispatchable power effectively does on the grid. It can add more or reduce the power going to the grid. So on December the 31st, 2014, at 23:59, the dispatchable power that we had on the grid was coal, 6,271. The gas was 7,143. The hydro was 894. But on December the 22nd, 2022, the dispatchable power we had was only 820 megawatts. So that's less 5,451 megawatts. The gas we had was much, much more, 10,894. So that's 3,751 megawatts more, but it still doesn't actually add up to this, does it? And the hydro was the same. We had added 70 megawatts of energy storage. We did have dual fuel. These are the coal plant conversions to gas for 466. And that's 13,144 megawatts. But that's 1,000 megawatts less dispatchable power than we had in 2014. At the same time, there's also been a dramatic change in the renewables megawatts on the grid. So in 2014, we only had wind at 1,434 megawatts. By 2022, we had wind of 3,618 and also solar of 1,138 for a total of 4,753 megawatts. What's the problem with that? Wind and solar are weather dependent. They can drop off suddenly and vanish for days or weeks. So you can't count on this power generation. And here's an example of wind collapse. This is from 2017. It's just a graph that I happen to have on hand. But you can see here wind was quite productive at this period of time. Boom, suddenly it dropped off and it was gone for, 4 days? Then it returned. In the meantime, we still needed we had the dispatched capacity from above $0 a megawatt hour, and we also had the capacity remaining for dispatch. So you can see that there was quite a bit of capacity still remaining, but we're not in that situation now. As of October the 1st, 2023, let's have a look at some of the ISO data. So this is the interchange. This is the flow of power to and from British Columbia, Montana, and Saskatchewan. When there's a minus sign, that means we're importing. When there's no minus sign, that means we're exporting. So this indicates generation. So there's a thing called maximum capability, which you can see here, MC. This means this is the installed capacity. This would be the maximum that any of these could put out. But that doesn't mean that's what they will put out, especially not for wind and solar, because they are weather dependent. And TNG, that stands for total net generation. So that's what these units are putting out. Now when it says gas, there's quite a number of gas units. There's a limited number of hydro units, also a limited number of energy storage. There are quite a few different solar farms, many wind farms. So these numbers here are the combined capacities of all the plants of that type. Other typically relates to combined heat and power, cogeneration. Dual fuel is for the conversions of the coal plants to gas. And coal, we do have like a remaining little buddy of coal. It's working all the time, almost at capacity all the time. So I took this screenshot this morning. So gas generation was 6,213 megawatts, hydro was 67, solar was nothing, wind was 808 out of 3,853, other was 219, dual fuel was over capacity actually at 467, and coal was at 820, and total net generation was 798, almost at capacity. And what's this column over here? This is called DCR. We'll look at that in the next slide. So you can see the change in capacity over December the 22nd, 2022. We have more, we have 919 more megawatts of gas. We have 154 megawatts of solar additional, and an additional 235 megawatts of wind. So at this time we are already 1,000 megawatts short. It looks like we almost added 1,000 megawatts, but because we also added additional wind and solar, we're still short dispatchable power. And what's this dispatched and accepted contingency reserve? Well, this is because the grid fluctuates, so you always have to have a little bit of spare power that you can call on quickly to step in to cover off any slump in production. So you can see here that under dispatched and accepted contingency reserve, there are nothing but zeros for solar, wind, other, dual fuel, and coal. Well, coal was at the maximum, so there's nothing left really, but these can never dispatch power because they are weather dependent. They are weather dependent, and so you never know if there will be power or not. The trick with the power grid is that supply and demand must almost perfectly match. So this is kind of a plain language discussion that one of our contributing engineers wrote up recently. So the normal frequency of our power supply is 60 cycles, hertz. And so you can see here the standard power line frequency is 60 hertz, meaning that the AC voltage oscillates at a rate of 60 complete back and forth cycles every second. So the simplest case of a small generator supplying a group of loads operating normally, it will maintain the 60 hertz to the accuracy of its governor, which is kind of a speed monitor, if you like. Now, if you suddenly add a big load to that generator, it tries to slow down. In other words, not 60 hertz anymore, something less. If the newly added load is too big, the generator will stall, and that's all she wrote. So it'll shut off, it'll trip. In the case of the provincial grid, the same effects occur, but with major differences. First, the frequency is tightly controlled, and if the small generator described above was connected to the grid would also attempt to meet the load addition. But if the local generator slowed down too much, the whole site would be tripped off, usually by over or under frequency relays, but also by load flow in some cases. In this case, too much is usually interpreted as a trip at under or over frequency of just 0.5 hertz at most. So it's a very tiny margin. In other words, the grid enforces careful management of loads and generation capacity. And that's why renewables are problematic, because they're unpredictable and they also deliver direct current power, not AC power. In the case of renewable power supplies, let's take solar as the key. Solar cells generate direct current, or DC power. There's no frequency at all, zero. So to be useful on the grid, there's a device called an inverter that converts the DC into the alternating current, AC, that we typically use. To do this, the inverter generates a series of pulses that approximate the more normal sine wave, that's the wave that I just showed you on the other page, form of the AC produced by a rotating generator, such as are the backbone of the power grid. That would be like natural gas generation. The produced approximate AC is then put to a transformer, which raises its voltage up to the level required for connection to the grid at that point. The generated frequency of the inverter starts at a solid 60 hertz to the accuracy it is built to, but really cannot respond to big load changes affecting its frequency, and in the simplest case would simply trip itself offline if there was too large a disturbance of its programmed output. In some historical cases, the too rapid load changes were as a result of summer storms or lightning strikes that disrupted a significant area and led to a cascading effect, failing a much larger area. The frequency following controls of the inverters were unable to follow the too rapid changes, and so protected themselves and the solar farms by tripping offline, leaving the rest of the grid in various kinds of troubles. So it's almost like when you have a power surge bar at home. If there's a surge of power, that unit is intended to protect your vital electronics. So it will click off and not allow your electronics to be damaged by a big dip or surge of power. So that's a very simplistic way of describing it, but it will give you a sense of the idea. But when that happens, of course, if it trips off a certain provider of power to the grid, let's say there's a solar farm that's been providing X amount of megawatts, suddenly big clouds roll in, there's a big change in the output, this triggers it offline, then all of a sudden there's a fairly significant disruption to the whole grid, and that has to be rebalanced and remanaged very, very quickly. Now, the ISO has all kinds of technical ways of doing that. Some are computerized, some are manual, but we're not going to get into that, but they've got lots of material on their website, by the way, so you can learn a lot there. But the point being that this adds an extra element of unreliability to the power grid, unpredictability to the power grid, and it's something that cannot be fixed. If you have a lot of reserve capacity of dispatchable power, then it's relatively easy to cover that gap. But if you have a shortage of dispatchable power, then you're facing a problem. So we talked a bit about dispatched contingency reserve, And that's where this becomes relevant. So the Alberta Electric System Operator normally manages for load swings, that means these variations, by having dispatch contingency generation on their site. Sudden load additions can be managed by allowing the grid to sag a little bit until the owner of the dispatched contingency reserve generator has a chance to crank up its output. The DCR generator is normally running at idle or light load, so it can produce more power in split seconds as its governor demands. So, this plant is already running. It's running at a lower speed or a lighter load, but it's already running. It's not that you're going to go and turn on a natural gas plant today and turn it off tomorrow. The challenge with renewables is that random amounts of generating capacity may be affected by extraneous or unpredictable events. Lightning, clouds, storms all come to mind. Renewables cannot provide dispatched contingency reserve generation because they don't generate power, they actually capture kinetic power, but that's something else. Leaving some form of frequency management, not the only other route to a stable grid, and a necessity if there's not a sufficiently large base of conventional generation. So large battery installations with comparable capacity or the requisite capacity may provide appropriate dispatchable contingency reserve to the overall grid. But we'll talk about batteries later as well. So this image is from the ISO. It's talking about the continued growth of renewables is anticipated. This shows that there's this much operational, this much under construction, this much has been approved by the AUC, that's the Alberta Utilities Commission. That's a separate body that does approvals of energy projects. But you can see here that there are huge amounts of wind and solar announced for the Alberta grid. And these totals are staggering. These are huge, huge amounts. And to put more renewables on the grid, you need additional base load to support it. Otherwise, as we just saw, you'll go to blackout. Now, if we did put all that on the grid, Alberta would start to look like a hedgehog. So that's something to think about. Or like a glassy lake if they were all solar panels. So let's talk about the problem of a blackout. It's not just that it's inconvenient for you as a consumer. There are very significant costs and implications. So I tried to find some material about blackout costs in Canada. I did find this one, but it's from 2003, the Ontario US power outage, which was pretty big. It's from Public Safety Canada. So it's a good one to look at because it is quite detailed. But let's just have a look at this quick little thing from that I found on the web. In a Grid Talk post last summer, this organization shared an update on the U.S. Department of Energy's cost of short interruptions. These are just blackouts lasting 5 minutes or less. And these in the U.S., the costs rose from $52 billion in 2002 to $60 billion in 2014. So this indicates that there are more unreliable incidents happening on the grid. So how about numbers in Canada? They couldn't find any, so they did their own analysis using this calculator. And what is the true cost of power outages in Canada? A staggering $12 billion. Now they're talking here about momentary and sustained outages, which cost $8 billion and $4 billion respectively. In Canada, momentary interruptions are 1 minute or less. So this sobering number paints a very clear picture. Outages cause downtime. Downtime equals economic and financial loss. And it's probably more significant now that we're all far more reliant on things like the internet for business transactions, for doing financial transactions, for operating many of the things that we rely on, whether it's security systems or some kind of internal operating system for buildings. So some of these things, like in hospitals, most equipment is set up with uninterruptible power supplies, which would allow a certain period of time so that they could start up their on-site emergency generation. But it's interesting to note that I'm pretty sure it's the Foothills changed out their diesel generation for natural gas as an emergency backup. So I wonder how that would impact the hospital under these regulations. Maybe not at all, but it's it's a question to be asked. So the last time I did a presentation on this topic, some people afterwards said to me, well, can you please explain what is a watt? All these numbers and terms are quite confusing for many people. So let's have a look at this. This comes from our report, Why Renewable Energy Cannot Replace Fossil Fuels by 2050. So that doesn't sound optimistic, does it? It's just a realist view. So anyway, a watt is the smallest unit of energy measurement, and the definition is 1 ampere of electric current flowing across a voltage drop of 1 volt, which equals 1 watt of energy. So the unit is small, but it's the building block for everything else. And you'll be familiar with a 60-watt light bulb, 100-watt light bulb. Then we have the megawatt. In power generation, especially in the sizes used for commercial production of electricity, the base unit of capacity is the megawatt. This unit is the simple watt multiplied by 1 million. So if you want to envision 10,000 people, 10,000, turning on 100 light bulbs each, all at the same time, because then they would be consuming 1 million watts, and 1 million watts, or 1 megawatt, of energy. And then gigawatt. When speaking of national generation capacities, the author of the study here uses the typical capacity unit of capacity, which is the gigawatt. Using a similar example, if the reader can imagine 10 million people, that's 10 million, all turning on that same 100-watt light bulb, then the reader is imagining the output of 1 gigawatt. And for the mathematically inclined, 1 gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. Capacity versus generation. Capacity is not the same as accomplishment. The reader may have the capacity to learn Sanskrit, but may not have accomplished the mastery of that language. Similarly, energy generation capacity is exactly not the same as the accomplishment of energy delivery or usage. So why is that relevant? Well, you'll often hear people say that wind or solar has a capacity of this or that, or it could provide the equivalent energy of X number of households. Well, first of all, it can't provide the equivalent energy of X number of households because those households need power 24/7, and you won't get that from renewables. And secondly, capacity just means if that was the maximum that it was putting out, that's the most capacity it could reach. But generation is the key thing that we're interested in, because you'll see later on that wind and solar have generation much less than their rated capacity, their nameplate capacity. So extending the above examples, if the electrical system has a capacity to deliver 100 watts of light bulb to each of the 10,000 people, in other words, the 1 megawatt capacity described above, and if you can do so for a time duration of 1 hour, that electrical system will have accomplished the delivery of 1 megawatt hour of energy. So the accomplishment is the product of a rate, 1 megawatt, multiplied by a duration, 1 hour in the example, for a quantity of energy equaling 1 megawatt hour. Now, how about the average electricity use in Alberta, just to try and put this in perspective? So according to ATCO, the average home in Alberta uses 600 kilowatt hours of electricity and 10 gigajoules of natural gas every month. And that works out to about 7,200 kilowatt hours a year of electricity. So it may be a bit more in some places, depends on how rich or poor you are, but that's an approximation. In Alberta, industry consumes 48% of power generation, commercial consumes 28%, residential is 20%, and farm 4%. And there are some industries in Alberta that also generate power for the grid. It's called cogeneration, combined heat and power. Now, these operators would be significantly affected by the clean electricity regulations. So this is from the ISO, and it shows you how the use of power or the consumption breaks down. So as I just said, 48% industrial, 28% commercial, 20% residential, 4% farm. And we're home to more than 4 million people. But the residential power consumption is really only about 1/5 of all the demand. So people might say, oh, well, let's just solve that 20% or so by having solar and batteries for homes. Well, this is from an interesting little blog post that we have by a professional engineer called Electricity from the Sun, Reality versus Fantasy. And if we assume, just to keep things simple, that the consumer uses a constant 855 kilowatt hours a month, then rooftop panels produce 464 kilowatt hours too much energy in July and 473 kilowatt hours too little in December. And he's referring here to this chart. This chart is the monthly output of a south-facing rooftop solar panel in Calgary. So you can see in January it's 424 kilowatt hours. But wow, look at this in July. It's 1,319. Sounds fantastic, right? So why don't we just store this in batteries? The problem is that it just doesn't work. So from October to February, solar output is 2,565 kilowatt hours, which is 1,710 kilowatt hours short of the 4,275 kilowatt hours consumed. And if we put a dozen of these homes together, so like a little neighborhood, the winter shortfall is 20,520 kilowatt hours, or just over 20 megawatt hours. So let's assume we want to supply these dozen homes with solar and batteries only. Here's a picture of TransAlta's $16 million 20 megawatt hour battery energy storage facility being built at Pincher Creek. It's actually now built and operating. So according to the Calgary Herald article, the project consists of 3 Tesla lithium-ion battery storage groupings, and it's slightly smaller than a soccer pitch, which is pretty big. So the cost of battery backup for each home solar energy system would be $1.3 million. And that would have to be repeated every 10 years, which is the expected battery life. Now imagine one of these for every dozen homes in your neighborhood. So you can see solar and batteries for home is not so simple. And how about that net zero 2035 target? Well, here's a definitive statement from an engineer at the ISO as to the annualized wind and solar generation in Alberta in 2022. The wind generation was 7,314 gigawatt hours. The solar generation was 1,165 gigawatt hours. That sounds huge, but these wind and solar generation represent 8.8% and 1.4% of the electricity generated in Alberta, respectively. So at the time that this was written, about 6 months ago, I guess, the fossil fuel-based generation is still above 80%. So much for net zero electricity in Alberta by 2035. Now, maybe you think Alberta is an outlier, maybe you think we're just being obnoxious out here in the West, rednecks or whatever you want to call people here, but let's look at the inconvenient facts from Natural Resources Canada. Here are the shares of electricity generation provided by coal, natural gas, and oil by province and territory in 2019. So there might be a modest difference in these numbers, but it won't be huge. So Nunavut was 100% fossil fuel, Alberta 89% at that time, Saskatchewan 81, Nova Scotia 76, Northwest Territories 50%, New Brunswick 28%, and Ontario 7%. And I must say this Ontario 7%, this natural gas in Ontario is what props up Quebec during the winter. And of course, let's think of the national objective. It's a net zero objective. So they want to take most things that are fossil fuel applications and make them electrified by 2035, which is less than 12 years. So these two graphs shows the total energy supply by source in Canada. This concerns everything, transportation, the whole works. And you can see that it's mostly fossil fuel based. You can't even see wind and solar on this chart. It's a very tiny little line right here. And our electricity generation, this is the total electricity generation by source in Canada. You can see that it's mostly hydro, which is great, very significant nuclear, declining coal, and natural gas. And again, you can barely see wind, which is this little white blob here, and this kind of pinky purpley thing, that's solar. So these are not going to be able to take over all of this, all of the fossil fuel component of this in the next 12 years, not even the next 27. And they're certainly not going to be able to add all of the uses like transportation and convert that into electricity in that time frame. Now, one thing that the ISO mentioned is baseload. And baseload is something that the environmental groups like to pretend is not necessary anymore. But it's necessary. So why do I say that about environmental groups? A lot of people in the climate activist, environmental community think that there's always wind somewhere. So all you have to do is hook up a lot of transmission and distribution lines and you'll be able to capture wind. So if it's windy off the coast of BC, we can pipe that right into Alberta and no problem. If it's windy in Alberta and there's no power in Quebec, we can pipe it right over there. That's not how it works. And you really need base load power, meaning that you need a consistent form of power to operate all the needs, sort of all the average needs of the consumers on the grid. And if we look at this image here, you can see that at 3 in the morning and 6 in the morning, you can see that there's not a huge demand, but as soon as we hit 6, all of a sudden the demand starts to go up. So let's say we need this power consistently all the time from some source. And it has to be a reliable source. It can't be wind and solar. Then on top of this, we have what are called peaker plants. So when there's a sudden rise in demand, these are also natural gas plants that can quickly add more power to the grid. So you cannot get the peaker supply from wind and solar because it's unpredictable. So you need to have base load. And let's look at the Alberta power generation by source here. So this is from the ISO, it's from their dashboard, and anyone can go there. They update this information every 15 minutes because there's always a changing flux in demand and supply. So the maximum capability is shown here: gas at 60%, wind at 20%, solar at 7%, hydro 5%, coal 4%, other being biomass and cogen. So, and over here we have the total generation, and that was at this time. This was yesterday when I was working on this as well. So it gives you the exact time and date, and you can see that actually wind was not performing. We have 20% capacity wind, but the actual generation was only 7% at the time. So what happened? Natural gas had to fill that gap, and coal had to fill that gap, and dual fuel had to fill that gap. So there was a little bit of solar there, you can see. It's not marked. But this is happening in a constant fluctuating pattern all day long. And we do also have interties. So I took this screenshot yesterday at the same time. We were importing from Saskatchewan, 89 megawatts, from Montana, 88 megawatts, and 10 we were exporting to BC. Now, both Saskatchewan and Montana operate on coal. So they too, or access to their power, may be compromised by the upcoming legislation. So the interties with Saskatchewan, Montana, and British Columbia allow us to import power if we need it, or export excess power. But these interties cannot be quickly or greatly expanded, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons for that. Some of them are technical, some are political, and there's a lot to read about that if you want. I don't think it's that pertinent to our present discussion. You see, and the other thing is weather is regional. So when we really need power, they will too. Now, of course, the Rocky Mountains are here, and BC often has very different weather than we do. But in terms of the prairies, often the weather patterns all across the prairies here are very similar. So if it's super cold in Saskatchewan, it's probably going to be super cold in Alberta, and they will need all their power. So we may not be able to draw from them. It's important to recognize that there is no 100% renewable electricity system in the world. So those who are demanding 100% renewable need a wake-up call. And this is a very good paper that discusses that. They show that there are all these modeling studies that provide convincing evidence that it's feasible, but there's just no actual 100% renewable electricity system in the world. And I really recommend that people read this report. It's a bit out of date in terms of some numbers, but again, the principles make a lot of sense and they're still pertinent. So what exactly is net zero? Well, here's what the Canadian federal government says. Achieving net zero emissions means our economy either emits no greenhouse gas emissions or offsets its emissions, for example, through actions such as tree planting or employing technologies that can capture carbon before it's released into the air. Then they go on to say this is essential to keep the world safe and livable for our kids and grandkids. We dispute that claim, and it's not supported by current climate science. And here's a screenshot from the Clean Electricity Regulations. So this visualizes what the plan is. So if we look at this, the main focus is clean electricity supply and generation. So they want to increase the non-emitting electricity, which is hydro, wind, solar, emerging renewables, nuclear, and hydrogen. And they want to reduce the emitting electricity, phase out coal-fired plants, phase down natural gas and diesel electricity. But as you saw, several provinces in Canada rely on fossil fuels. Then they want to increase clean electricity supply for the grid, so they are going to increase clean electricity transmission and storage. So they want to advance the interties to supply clean electricity to all regions. As I explained to you, that's not as simple as it sounds. It always sounds pretty easy. You know, why can't we just string some distribution or some transmission lines between the provinces? First of all, that's incredibly expensive. Secondly, very difficult to get land right-of-ways. You know, if you want to do that kind of thing, it's probably more complicated than putting a pipeline through somewhere. And we know how troublesome pipelines have been. But trying to get right-of-ways for transmission lines, you know, where you're going through people's property, is a very time-consuming and complex challenge. Because, you know, not only do you have to negotiate with the persons whose land it is and make a fair deal, but that land also has to be suitable for what you want to build there. Some places people might be amenable and say, yes, please build on my property and give me lots of money for it, but maybe the ground conditions are not suitable. So it's a complex challenge. Geography, topography, property rights. It takes many years to get these things negotiated and done. And then after you do that, you have to order all of the materials, all those big cables, the big towers, the pillars, the cement for the footings. It's a very, very big construction project. So these kinds of things do not happen overnight. Some of the land negotiations can take well over a decade, and just ordering the materials that you need in order to build it, let alone starting construction, let alone all the environmental approvals, it's not an easy thing. It doesn't happen overnight. So 12 years would certainly not be enough time. But let's continue here. Grid modernization. A lot of people are putting a lot of stock in this. Oh, if we had smart grids, then when there's power here, we can send it there. And they think, oh, grid storage, that would be easy. Well, as I showed you above, it would be very expensive, and you have to replace the batteries every 10 years. So they think that with increased access to clean electricity, all kinds of wonderful things will happen. For instance, they want to switch cars and trucks to electric vehicles, electrify the rail, marine, and off-road vehicle charging infrastructure. They want to put heat pumps for space and water heating, energy-efficient lighting, windows, HVAC, building envelopes. That means, you know, building around a building with additional insulation. Electrothermal technologies. This would be for like the steel industry, trying to make green steel, but that demands a lot more electricity. Electric processes, equipment and machines, oil and gas, the electrification of natural gas and LNG processes, electric equipment and machines, turbines, pumps and compressors. This means there would be a huge increase in demand for electricity, because electricity is a secondary form of energy. It has to be made by something. And again, a lot of activists put a lot of stock in energy efficiency, but really, especially in a cold country like Canada, I'd say there are very significant limitations on energy efficiency. Not to mention, remember that all of these changes have huge embedded emissions. So it's important to ask, are we actually creating more emissions in the embedded form in trying to reduce emissions elsewhere? So there are some possibilities, like there are some emerging opportunities here in innovation and R&D. One of those, which was briefly addressed in the ISO press conference, were SMRs, small modular reactors, CCS, that's carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen. Then they also talked about smart grids and batteries, distributed energy. These are, again, complicated features, I think. largely because they also require a lot of energy. And most of the ideas here require a lot of time to implement, but they're trying to implement them all at the same time in the same time framework. Not only that, in the clean electricity regulations, there are very strict limits on emissions. So they want to go from this to this in terms of emissions. And there are two standards. One is a performance standard. Emissions cannot surpass this intensity at all, ever. And there's also financial compliance. So if you did happen to, you would have to pay a very significant price, or you'd have to buy offsets, or pay a price that corresponds to the federal carbon price, which is applicable that year. And you have to meet both those standards. So that's like a huge challenge for Alberta and for Canada. Alberta's population is growing. Alberta's industry is growing. Canada is bringing in about 1 million immigrants a year. Canada hosts an additional approximately 1 million foreign students every year. Canada plans to decarbonize transportation and go electric. Canada plans to decarbonize much of industry and go electric or zero emissions, as I noted in the illustration. So that would be hydrogen or carbon capture. So electricity demand will skyrocket, and wind and solar cannot meet reliability, affordability, or standalone needs. So let's look at the actual text of part of the Clean Electricity Regulations, the draft. So when they're talking about new units, they are setting a date for when that unit would be subject to current electricity policies. And starting on January the 1st, 2035, the Clean Electricity Regulations and its performance standards and associated financial compliance component would replace current electricity sector policies. And while the Clean Electricity Regulation limits would only become binding in 2035, note this, it's expected they will deter any unabated new fossil fuel-fired generation in Canada. It means it will drive off anyone who's going to want to build a fossil-fueled generation plant. That's the intention of the regulations. And also, they'll have to take into consideration the CER obligations. So existing units will have some ability to operate, but again, they come under this legislation on January the 1st, 2035, and the eligible forms of financial compliance are to be determined, but could include the production or purchase of high-quality offsets, verified negative emissions, or paying an amount that corresponds to the federal carbon price or the relevant compliance record. So they would allow some emissions for units operating in an emergency situation, and I believe the ISO said that they were going to, the CER regulations allow for 450 hours or 18 days of operation. Anyone from Alberta knows that winter is longer than 18 days. And regarding cogeneration, it would regulate cogeneration that offer electricity for sale to the electricity system. So that creates a problem because all of the cogeneration now is quite a significant chunk of solid baseload power for Alberta. That would vanish under these regulations. So a cogenerator could use that power for their own operations, but they could not sell it to the grid unless they instituted carbon capture and storage. And the performance standard of the Clean Electricity Regulations would be implemented under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and that means if you violate it, you go to jail. So this is actually in the Act. The maximum penalties include fines of up to $1 million a day for each day an offense continues, imprisonment for up to 3 years, or both. The Act includes mandatory sentencing criteria for consideration by the courts, such as the cost to remedy the damage done to the environment. Violators may also have to pay for cleanup costs or forfeit any profits earned as the result of an offense. Corporate officials can be prosecuted if they authorize, accept, or participate in any violation of SEPA 1999 or its regulations. Well, that's kind of a great way to put off investors, right? So actually, the federal government is saying that if you don't kowtow to these regulations, then under SEPA, you could be convicted of a criminal offense, thrown in jail, your company could lose all the profits, and you could be fined millions of dollars. And as we saw in the very opening of this, Minister Guilbeault is saying that he's not going to make any allowances for Alberta. So what can we conclude from that? But is Alberta being obstreperous? Are we just trying to block the way? Well, no. We have the Shepard Energy Centre, which is just outside Calgary. It's a combined cycle gas turbine. This baby is working 24/7, let me tell you. Anytime I've looked at the ISO stats, it's going pretty much flat out. So it cost $1.4 billion. It was announced by NMAX in 2007. Construction began in the fall of 2011, and the plant became operational in 2015. So you can see here that it takes a long time to build these things. And I would say that's probably a prompt timeline here. I'm guessing that they probably had it in the planning quite a bit before that. And NMAX hopes to make the Shepard Energy Centre home to the first commercial scale natural gas combined cycle NGCC carbon capture unit in North America. So what does that mean? Well, that means that this is a new kind of technology. It means it's a new thing in North America. So when the ISO was talking about, untested, operational things like carbon capture and storage for natural gas plants, and how they were talking about they didn't know if it would scale up, this is the kind of thing they're talking about. There's no one in North America who's done this yet. So if NMAX succeeds with their pilot project, that would be fantastic. But once you've done a pilot project, you still have to know, will it scale up? Because sometimes when you try to make things bigger or have more capacity, somehow it just doesn't work, or you run into various technical problems that were not anticipated. Until you make the thing run, a lot of times you just don't know. So the Alberta government is underwriting this project. They have, it's called the FEED study. So a front-end engineering and design study. And this will help determine the feasibility of constructing and integrating a carbon capture unit at the Shepard Energy Centre. So the other thing here, if you look at the video that's on the site that I just showed you, you can see all this equipment. This is not just like off-the-shelf stuff. A lot of things in these plants are custom ordered, and they're designed for that specific plant, for that specific weather condition, for the operational standards of that particular facility. So these things take a lot of time and planning, and even just ordering them takes a long time. So practically speaking, for net zero plans, pilot projects must be run first. If they're successful, can they be scaled up? Design and approval stages have to go through. Financing has to be done. There's an environmental assessment process. If it's approved, Then there's the commissioning, the ordering of the equipment and infrastructure. These are long lead times. The supply chain issues, dramatically shifting costs, may affect the outcome. So, you might say you want to have your gas plant built with carbon capture and storage by 2035. But between now and then, you could be held up in environmental approvals. That we know that happens with all kinds of pipelines in Canada. You might have problems with receiving some essential materials that you need. The costs might go up dramatically. And all of the net zero competitors in the world right now are seeking the same solutions. So prices are going up for all of the different kinds of components that are required. And on top of that, there's the human power and the labor costs. And in Canada, there are also weather restrictions. Sometimes you just can't do certain forms of construction in certain periods of weather, or certain seasons. So, shall we believe the foreign-funded Pembina Institute and their models? As you saw in one of the opening screenshots of news stories, Pembina claims to have all kinds of pathways to an affordable net zero grid in Alberta. And they are pressing for it's critical that Alberta commit to achieving a net zero grid by 2035. Why? It's not critical, but they say that it is. And they're quite influential, and you have to realize that Pembina Institute, it was Marlo Reynolds who actually founded the Strathmere Group, which is a group of the top 14 environmental groups in Canada who meet regularly to strategize. So, when you see David Suzuki Foundation running, a point-and-click campaign, tell Premier Smith you want renewables, 100% renewable by 2035, or net zero by 2035. Well, that's because they all had a meeting about it, and they're all using different angles and strategies with their followers to try and push public policy in the direction that they want. It's, the problem I have with it is that a lot of these groups are foreign funded, and they're foreign funded for the purpose, as stated in the grant documents, to push clean energy in Canada. And that's outside, in my opinion, outside the democratic process. But because there's so many groups acting together, and because they're sending in, 5,000, 10,000 point-and-click emails, people go, wow, I guess the public really want this. Well, it's not clear that the public want it, but the funders do. So I'm a bit cautious on this side. Not to mention, I think that we should listen to an energy expert like Václav Smil. So he's published 47 books on energy, more than 500 papers on these topics, and he's a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Manitoba. So I just took some comments from a very interesting video that he did for the Trottier Institute in Montreal. And he was talking with a whole room full of engineers. His talk is called Energy Revolution, More Like a Crawl. So he starts off by saying, I want to leave you with 5 messages to take away. We are a fossil-fueled civilization. Number 2, we shall remain so for a long time to come because, number 3, energy transitions take a great deal of time because, number 4, scale matters, and number 5, so does power density. So what does he mean by power density? Well, different fuels give a different proportion of energy as a result of their use. So here you can see how wood, coal, ethanol, biodiesel, crude oil, diesel, gasoline, and natural gas compare. So natural gas is obviously quite powerful in terms of energy density. And you can see over here that wind and battery power is not very dense at all. And actually the best is, of course, nuclear. Hydrogen is also very significant, but hydrogen is quite tricky to handle. So he goes on to say, 25 years is enough time to get things going substantially. In 1990, what percentage of global primary energy came from fossil fuels? So he asks the audience, then he tells them 90%. What percent will come from fossil fuels this year? That was in 2015. 87%. What percent is renewables, wind and solar? 2.5%. And in the next 25 years, suppose we double it, 5%. So what he's saying here is that of the energy produced in the world, 87% in 2015 was fossil fuels. Then there was nuclear and hydro and biomass filling that other gap of 13%. And of the 13%, wind and solar were only 2.5%. So in the next 25 years, suppose we double it, you'd get to 5% wind and solar in the world. Suppose over the next 25 years, we massively up everything, subsidize like crazy. We force everyone to do it, like the federal government is trying to do to Alberta, to triple the rate of introduction of renewables. Well, we'll be at 7.5 or 8%. So now he makes a qualifying statement here. He says, in a small nation, you can move very rapidly. You can do a rapid energy transition. And he gives us an example of Holland, which went from using peat to coal to natural gas in a very short period of time. But he says quite specifically, in a big nation, you cannot do it. And also with regard to Holland, you'll often hear the climate activists and the liberals will often say, oh, Denmark, they did this in Denmark. Denmark has big wind farms, and in Denmark everybody rides bikes. And well, Denmark is the size of a postage stamp, and so is Holland. I love Holland, but the Netherlands, but it's not a big place. So in these small places like the Netherlands, you can do it. But in a big nation like Canada, or even a big province like Alberta, you cannot do it. And he also points out in his talk that more sophisticated conversions have many limits in terms of supply and technology. And here I'd like to just note that, like for instance, he points out that when you have wood, you just throw it on the fire. When you have coal, it's more energy dense, and you don't need to do a lot more with it than you did with wood, because they're quite similar. In fact, coal used to be wood. But when you get to natural gas, for instance, well, then you need pressurized piping, you need special gas turbines, and the gas turbines are quite efficient, but like he said in that presentation, there's only about 5 companies in the world that make gas turbines. So he said, I can have all the natural gas that I want, but I need a gas turbine in order to create electricity on the grid. So, it's a challenge always to get the sophisticated technical equipment. And also with regard to, say, hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very elusive molecule. It's the smallest molecule. It has the unusual quality that it can embrittle pipe, meaning that where you could pipe natural gas through a pipe with no problem, when you're trying to put hydrogen through that same pipe, it will make the pipe brittle, and then it can start to sneak out because it's so light and so small. And the problem is it has to be highly pressurized in order to maintain any useful body of it. And it's an invisible gas. Its flame is also invisible. So in Alberta, we do already produce a lot of hydrogen in industrial settings. So they're quite safe because they're instrumentally monitored. There are safety protocols, the people are trained. But once you start trying to move that into the consumer world, it can become problematic in terms of safety because it's really a hazardous material and very explosive compared to natural gas. Like the blast field of hydrogen is the size of a football field. So as I said, more sophisticated conversions have many limits in terms of supply and technology. Let's look at some examples. I recommend that people have a look at Robert Lyman's report, Speed Bumps on the Road to Decarbonization. This is a summary of a J.P. Morgan report, which was written by Michael Chimbalist. And one of the elements in it, he talks about CCUS, and it should be noted that after 20 years of planning, subsidies, and political promotion, by the end of 2020, carbon capture and storage facilities stored just 0.1% of global CO2 emissions. Now, Alberta does have the ability to do this. We already know how to do it, and we're doing it. And in fact, our president was involved in one of the first CCUS projects that we know of. And he said it's quite complex and need to use a lot of exotic materials. But we do know how to do it, but it's just not scaled up yet, as Václav Smil was talking about. And in fact, the most advances in carbon capture and storage are in the academic papers on it. And as mentioned, new methods and substances can be expensive and tricky to handle. So for taxpayers, you might want to read this Robert Lyman report about carbon capture and storage trap, because industry knows how to do it, but do you want to pay for it, and for how long? You might also want to read Canada's Hydrogen Policy Fiasco, because the aspirational view of climate campaigners is that immense amounts of hydrogen can be produced by electrolysis using renewable energy generated electricity with no emissions. Currently, however, the estimated cost of such generation using wind and solar energy is 17 times the cost of natural gas. So we already do create and produce hydrogen in Alberta from natural gas, but you should have a look at this and understand the vast abyss between energy realists in Alberta and climate activists. And also Professor Samuel Farfari's book on the hydrogen illusion is very good because it puts in perspective what we do need hydrogen for, such as fertilizer, we really need it there, and how it's unlikely to be the best option for things like home heating. There's also potential limits on the materials supply chain, which the ISO didn't get into that in their press conference, but it's a very real thing. First of all of the Western nations are all at the same time pursuing net zero. So they are bumping up the price of all the material chain and driving demand. But not everybody's going to be able to get what they need. The report summarizes part of Simon Michaud's report. This is Simon Michaud's report, an excerpt, and it's talking about how long would it take us to mine all the copper that we need for the assumed net zero targets. And it's a great report. He does a great video or two online. You know, it's much easier to understand it if you see him presented than me. But you can see that he's extrapolated the global metal production in 2019 to what we might need in the future. And just to produce it at that rate, it would take 189.1 years for copper, 400.2 years for nickel, 9,920.7 years for lithium, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to run into these materials shortages, which would affect adding some of these things to the grid. And there's also a reality check on demand. You know, this is SNC Lavalин's engineering analysis of the amount of energy that we would need. And several net zero carbon emissions studies conclude that Canada's electricity annual demand would see significant increase from 500 terawatt hours to somewhere between 1,250 to 2,000 terawatt hours by 2050, with most scenarios estimating a total electricity demand of around 1,500 terawatt hours. So to put things into perspective, using today's specific capacity factors, and without accounting for the replacement of existing aging generation, if one were to meet this challenge using only one power generation type, additional capacities required to add 1,000 terawatt hours would translate into 115 times 1,100 megawatt sized large hydro reservoirs, similar in capacity to BC Hydro's Site C project, which is now 30 years in the making, still not operational, and many billions of dollars over budget. Or 114 times 1,000 megawatt sized large nuclear reactors, which would be like 19 sites the size of Bruce Power. And they also took a long time to build. Or 380 times 300 megawatt small nuclear reactors. Now, the ISO did discuss this as a possibility, and it is something that Alberta and Saskatchewan are both working on, but they're not market ready. So it's not in the market yet, and there's no pilot project up and running in this area yet. So it's potentially a good thing, potentially real, but it's not real yet. Or 20,000 times 10 megawatt sized wind turbines, 200 wind farms with 100 turbines for an aggregated capacity of 1,000 megawatts per site, or more than 400 gigawatts of aggregate solar capacities. But all of these need equivalent baseload power. So if we go back to the clean electricity regulations, it doesn't look like this is going to be so simple to implement, and it doesn't look like we'll be able to just get rid of this overnight. And of course people say, oh, well, we can use batteries, but batteries are not the answer, and I invite you to read this report written by professional engineers who work in the power generation industry. So batteries can reasonably manage the intermittency and non-dispatchability of wind and solar generation over periods lasting up to a few hours, but they cannot economically manage months-long seasonal variation in wind, sun, and cloud. And at today's prices, the batteries needed to ensure a reliable supply of electricity from wind and solar generators in Alberta would cost almost $2 trillion. So $2 trillion is almost 6 times Alberta's 2019 GDP of $353 billion. For you to earn $2 trillion, you'd have to earn $1 million a day for 5,476 years. Spending this astronomical sum on electricity infrastructure would raise the price of electricity to nearly $5 a kilowatt hour, almost 100 times greater than the average 2011 to 2020 wholesale price in the market of 5 cents per kilowatt hour. For the aforementioned Canadian homes, whose consumption works out to be about 10,800 kilowatt hours a year, the electricity bill would be $51,000 per year, an amount far beyond the ability of most Albertans to pay. So really, we're looking at billions for blackouts. And there's a few reports here. We also did a live stream of this. So it's on our blog. We did a report, the Clean Electricity Standard. This is from last fall. It's quite an easy read. It compiles a lot of our materials. There's lots of pictures and images to help you navigate the challenges. What you really need to know about renewable energy that the Pembina Institute won't tell you, this is a very important report, especially for policymakers. And this one probably is better suited to ordinary people as well, in the dark on renewables. And this explains why and how these deficits happen in winter, even though people say, oh, Alberta is the best place in the world, in Canada, for solar and wind. True, but it's still not the best place in the world for it. It's not the solution. So just to sum up, those are my insights on what I think the Alberta Electric System Operator was trying to tell the public, that it's not possible to meet the 2035 clean electricity regulation targets. There's not enough baseload supply. It would risk blackouts. We're already have been close to that 7 times last fall. And this absurd threat of short-term operation for baseload gas plants, combined with the potential for criminal charges, drives off investors. And just another note on that, if you're a company and if you're an investor and you're planning to build a plant, say like the Shepherd plant in Calgary, that costs $1.4 billion, that plant has to operate over a certain period of time profitably for you to make money back on your investment. So the limitations on that plant operating, and also the requirement for abatement, that being carbon capture and storage, which, as I showed you, is not yet really a viable thing, because not even Shepherd Energy Plant has completed their test project, right? And that would be the first one in North America. So you don't want to put a lot of money into a project where the regulations are already telling you, hey, at this date, you can't operate it that way anymore. And if you do, we're going to potentially fine you, maybe throw you in jail, and maybe also take away your profits. These are really extreme threats, and it's not the kind of thing that's going to draw people in. And ironically, for all the people who are saying, well, we want to put more renewables on the grid, well, we can't build any more renewables either, because if we don't have reliable baseload power, we can't have more renewables, period. Otherwise, we will go to blackout. So, as we said in the very beginning, or near the beginning when we talked about net zero, the government was saying that this is all necessary to make sure that a future is safe for our children. But it turns out that the climate emergency stems from the misuse of this graph and these scenarios. So these are called representative concentration pathways, and they were various simulations using different amounts of carbon dioxide, different population levels, different assumptions about the use of different forms of energy. But unfortunately, a group of green billionaires and ENGOs published this report, and it proliferated through financial markets, through banking, and ultimately into the peer-reviewed literature, using RCP 8.5 as the business as usual scenario, which it is not. This is an implausible scenario. This is a scenario that has no climate mitigation projects in it whatsoever. It requires the huge increase in the use of oil, gas, and coal. I think something like 7 times the amount of coal that there is on Earth, something to that effect. We have a report on it. You can find it online by Robert Lyman. But anyway, so this became used as the standard, and it's the most catastrophic. And of course, when you look at it here, then it does look like, wow, that would be really bad if that were related to the temperature. But without RCP 8.5 and RCP 6.0, there is no climate emergency. We do have time. And there's a whole report by Roger Pielke Jr. He and Canadian researcher Justin Ritchie wrote a report called Distorting Our Climate Future. It's a peer-reviewed paper. It talks about how this RCP 8.5 has just proliferated everywhere and totally distorted our understanding of climate change. And without them, there's no emergency. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't take care of the environment. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be considering our impacts on the world. But it does mean that there's no emergency. So we don't have to do this, and we certainly don't have to do this in the time frame of 12 years. And just to make sure that people know what kind of a big emitter we are. Alberta's contribution to warming over the past century is 6 thousandths of a degree Celsius. And we should think of geopolitics as well. China wants to be the world's factory by 2025. So why would we be handing them a competitive advantage by making it so difficult and so expensive for our industry to produce things here in Alberta? See, China emits in 1 month about what Canada emits in 1.5 years. Let me say that again. China emits in 1 month about what Canada emits in 1.5 years. So, with all the discussion about China's influence in Canada, I think we should also look at those geopolitics and consider whether or not we're under a green trade war. So if you'd like to know more about these things, come to our event. Ticket sales end this week, October 6th. Our event will be on October the 17th at the Red and White Club. It's our 20th annual climate science event. It's the first time we're back with a live event after COVID lockdowns, and it's called Break Free from Climate Tyranny, Evidence over Ideology. So Robert Lyman will be one of our speakers. He's an energy economist. He's written many reports for us. He worked with the federal government for 27 years. He was a diplomat for 10 years. And his topic will be, when will climate policy hit the wall? And Dr. Ian Clark, Emeritus Professor from the University of Ottawa, will be our other speaker. And he'll be talking on a reality check on climate and net zero, which seems like the perfect topic. These are really fun events. It's a very convivial evening. The catering at the Red and White Club is always delicious, and it's a really nice evening. So I hope that you'll be able to make it. Tickets are online. We don't sell any tickets at the last minute, so please order in advance because we have to get the catering order in. And if you would like to become a member of Friends of Science, you can do that online as well. Then you'll get our Cli-Sci and Extracts newsletters and our quarterly newsletters, our reports, our press releases. You can pick and choose which ones you want to receive, but you'll get more information that you will never see in the mainstream press here in Canada, that's for sure. So I thank you for listening to my long discussion about these important issues. I hope that it was plain language enough, not too technically overwhelming, and also technically I hope it wasn't too offside, but I'll hear from my engineering team if that's the case. So I thank you all for joining me today, and let's try and have open, civil debate on these climate and energy policies and full cost-benefit analysis, because it's quite clear that some of these policies are really leading us into danger as a society, leading us into dangerous blackouts, dangerous shortages, and compromised power grids all across Canada, not just in Alberta, because I showed you that a number of provinces are heavily reliant on oil and natural gas and coal. And in fact, I did mention about Ontario propping up Quebec. That's very true. In Quebec, they switched out a lot of their housing to electrical heating. So now in winter, the demand is extremely high, and they're also trying to add electrical vehicles. So Parker Gallant has quite a few articles on how Ontario natural gas is exports is the only thing that's keeping Quebec from going to black. And yet in Ontario, there's quite an avid climate campaign group. They want to shut down natural gas generation in Ontario. So that would mean that people in Quebec would suffer in winter without enough power. So these are like really complex machines, if you like. The power grid is like the most complex machine in the world, and yet we have a lot of climate activists tinkering with it when they really don't know how it works. And because they're so good at, getting the public on side and getting those point and click campaigns going, then politicians often fall for it and say, well, I guess that's what the people want. Well, the people are not power generation engineers. And so they're pushing for policies that really will put people at risk of heat or heat poverty, at risk of blackouts. And blackouts, once they start, can be not just a couple of hours, they can be days. So, or God forbid, weeks. But you don't want to tamper with the power grid. You want professionals running it, and you want to have enough baseload power and backup so that you don't go to black. Enough from me. Thanks very much. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.